If you're seeing somebody clean and jerk 200 kilos every single day when you're a kid, you think that's normal. So you just say, okay, it's not like if I'm gonna clean and jerk 200 kilos, it's when.
That's Travis Cooper, 7-time national champion, 2-time Pan Am medalist with over 20 years of experience in the sport of weightlifting.
I went to the Olympic Training Center and my total went from 275 to 320 in a year and a half.
In this interview, we discuss the 7 lessons Travis learned from legendary coach Glenn Pendlay, including the importance of tailoring your training to the athlete.
What works for one athlete is not necessarily what works for another athlete. Jared Fleming and John North were both 94 kilo athletes. But Jared really didn't have the kind of work capacity to go heavy often. John really responded to like really high volume, and he's really hype and likes to train a lot. And the way that Glenn would coach him is a lot different than the way that he would coach Jared.
And the importance of collaboration between athlete and coaches.
If the athlete believes in the program, even if it's not the ideal way to train or the ideal thing to do, they're going to do it hard and they're going to go for it, and they're going to have a better result than if they're halfway into what the coach is dictating them to do.
Let's dive in. Welcome back to a special edition of the Last Set Best Set podcast. This is a collab edition with the Weightlifting Scoop. I'm Coach Brian. I'm the owner of Big Ben Strength. I've been teaching Olympic lifting for 11 years now.
And I'm Coach Calvin. I'm current captain of Lindenwood University's Olympic weightlifting program, as well as a coach through Big Ben Strength.
And today we've got a special guest for you guys, one that I spent a lot of time watching compete in weightlifting. He also was an athlete under my former coach, Glenn Pendlay, and that is Travis Cooper. Travis, thank you for joining us.
Absolutely, guys. I appreciate you having me on.
Travis, do you mind giving a brief just explanation of how you got into the sport and what your numbers were?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I got to this sport over 20 years ago now. It seems crazy. In 2004, I was wrestling. I was trying to figure out a way to get better at wrestling. Walked into a place called Velocity Sports Performance. You may or may not have heard of it. And it was like a concept to get people ready for combines before CrossFit existed. And so it was popular for a little while, but I found my weightlifting coach there. My first weightlifting coach, his name was CJ Stockel. And, I talked to him. I was really looking for more of a conditioning type training, but he was a weightlifting coach, and he found out that I had already back squatted like 500 pounds. I think he didn't believe me at first, and then we did some squats at like 405, and he's like, all right, like you are pretty strong, like you're a weightlifter now. And come back tomorrow, and essentially you're training like 4 days a week from now on, and I just did it. So that's really my origin story.
I heard a story once that the first time that you maxed out your squat, you did 405. Is that true?
Yes. I mean, that wasn't the first time I squatted, but when I was in 9th grade, I maxed out my back squat, and I squatted 405, and I had wrestled 140 pounds. So it wasn't quite triple body weight, because I'm sure I was over 140 pounds, but it was a pretty strong squatter from the beginning. And it wasn't like, sometimes in high schools, they don't have good strength and conditioning programs. They're squatting high. Like, we were always like, you got to squat below parallel. I will say it was probably between a high bar and low bar squat. It certainly wasn't low bar, but I could see how it's like more of a hybrid where we're pushing our hips back a little more. But yeah, that was my first maximum. I did do some squatting when I was a kid, and I went to this conditioning camp, which was essentially like fat camp, really, like I was a fat kid. And my parents sent me to this to be like a better athlete, quote unquote, probably because they just thought I was fat or something. But anyways, it was awesome. We basically like lifted weights for 2 hours and ran for an hour and a half. And you wouldn't be able to walk down the stairs the next day, and you would go back 4 days a week. So I had done a lot of high volume squatting and leg pressing prior.
How did your numbers, like including Olympic lifts, like progress throughout the years from that point on?
Yeah, I think like we had done some snatches in my high school strength and conditioning prior to this, but I was always taught like snatch is an explosive movement that you just do super light weight with, and you work on speed, right? So I didn't think people did this movement heavy, and we just did like power snatches at like 95 pounds to 135 pounds, right? And hardly anyone could power snatch 135 in my high school, although they were like big squatters and stuff like that. So I went to Velocity, and there was a guy named Chandler Alford, and he was a junior national champion. And so, at that time, he was really good. So in the 77 kilo weight class, he totaled about like 285. So he was snatching like 120 and clean jerking 160 or so at that time, when I first started, and I saw him snatch like 110 or 120, and I was like, I had never really seen people who were like way stronger than me at my body weight. So I went home in my basement where I had some weights, and I had like, the metal weights with like a bench press bar, like a really thick one. And I maxed out my power snatch, and I remember I did like 70 kilos, and it hurt so bad. Like I just called it weird. I had never really done this. Like it was just like painful, and I was like, holy crap. People do like 120. I was like, I got some work to do, right? So um, I think, I got to 100 kilo snatch and like 125 clean and jerk in the 77 kilo weight class fairly quickly. And then from there, I think within a couple years, I was doing like a 265 total. And then I went to the Olympic Training Center when my total was about 275. And I lived there for a year from 2007 to 2008. And my total went from 275 to 320 in a year and a half. And this is basically, yeah, so like insane progress. The coach was, really impressed with that progress. And so I was able to continue to stay there for that whole year and a half, which was exciting. But that's obviously the biggest amount of progress that I ever, made was the years from like 19 to 20 years old.
And when you were at the training center, was that Dragomir that was coaching at the time?
Dragomir was done coaching at that point. The coach was named Paul Fleschler. He's still around, but sort of more under the radar. Like he was at finals, but not many people know who he is anymore.
I have heard his name. I couldn't picture him, but and so then while you guys were at the Olympic Training Center, what do you think? Like, what was your training looking like at that time to take you from that 275 to your 320 total?
Yeah, I mean, it all comes down to like progressive overload, right? So like if you are able to increase the volume that you're doing at heavier weights, that's how you get stronger. But you have to do that in a very particular manner. And I think basically like the most I had ever trained was 5 days a week. So we went from training 5 times a week to 9 times a week immediately. And, because when you're resident at the OTC, you train twice, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, once, Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday. So it's 9 sessions. And so it just comes down to more training, and my body adapted to it because I was really resilient. I think the one thing that you can somewhat train someone to be is resilient and durable, but some of that is innate, and some of it is like body size, right? Like longer, lankier people, if you catch like one snatch and it's a little off, like all of a sudden you're at extreme risk for injury. But like a shorter, stocky person like me is typically going to be more resilient to heavy training.
And so from the Olympic Training Center, how did you end up working with Glenn?
Yeah, so after 2008, like basically, there was the Olympic trials. They were making cuts at the USOC at the time, USOPC now. Um, I didn't lose my spot because I was still young. However, I didn't really see a future there, and I wanted to finish school at Georgia Tech. So I finished my degree at Georgia Tech in eventually computer science. And um, so I was training on my own. I went from like being a resident at the OTC to like coaching myself and following like John Bros and Pat Mendez and basically maxing out 7 days a week, and for better or worse of that. And Glenn started streaming. Uh, these weren't like normal things, right? Now you see like Dylan Cooper streaming and people tune into it, and that's normal. But back in the day, there was no Twitch. There was nothing like this. Like streaming services were like brand new. So Glenn had bought a camera and he was coaching the people at Cal Strength. And this was like kind of revolutionary at that time. It seems obvious now because everybody does it. But when no one was doing it, it almost seemed like narcissistic to like video your team's training, right? So I would tune in and basically I would try to out-snatch Kevin Cornell and out-clean and jerk John, because John was a much better snatcher, but I could clean and jerk with him, and Kevin was a good snatcher, And at that time, his clean and jerk wasn't what it became. So um, I would just follow it, interact with those guys. I knew Glenn because I had been in the sport since 2004, so we knew of each other, but we weren't close. And he asked me to spend a month at Cal Strength. And so I did. He wanted me to move to California, but it's so expensive. I'm from Georgia. I was not interested. And so eventually, when they moved to South Carolina, close to Charlotte, North Carolina, but it's like Fort Mill, South Carolina, he told me, and I was like, well, I can do that. That's close enough to home. That's only like 3.5 hours. So, like, I'll definitely move there. So that's how I got connected with Glenn, and he became my full-time coach at that point.
So when you guys were at Muscle Driver, I've heard just absolutely insane stories about what the training was like. And anywhere from doing multiple sessions a day, building up to a heavy or moderately heavy single, like up to 8 times a day, I believe that I've heard. I don't know how much of this is true. And then also just that you guys were going heavy really, really often. I think that there's also maybe a little bit of mystery around what the programming was actually like at Muscle Driver. It sometimes hard to piece together from the YouTube training. So can you break down what it was like training at Muscle Driver?
I didn't know what Muscle Driver was until Brian told me, I don't know, what was that, like 6 months ago? So maybe we could like intro what Muscle Driver even is, because I feel like a lot of our younger audience might not even know.
Tired of programming that doesn't work? Inconsistent technique, missing lifts, or going months without PRs is all signs that your program isn't working. If this is you, I'd like you to consider joining the OlyStrong team, my online weightlifting program available in 3, 4, and 5 days a week for weightlifters looking to dial in their technique, get strong, and most importantly, set PRs. Each week is structured to support the things all weightlifters need. Enough practice in the snatch and clean and jerk to dial in your technique, a consistent strength program to build big squats, pulls, and presses, and accessory work carefully chosen to build muscle that supports your Olympic lifts. The program uses logical progressions that focus on building momentum each week instead of just maxing out every week, or worse, only lifting light to work on your technique. If this sounds like something you need, then scan the QR code on the screen or click the link in the description below for a free week trial today. All right, back to the show.
Yeah, so Muscle Driver USA was a company that Glenn was very entrepreneurial in different areas, and one area is he created Pendlay barbells. So he made like do-in weightlifting shoes, Pendlay barbells, and eventually a company, Muscle Driver USA, bought out Pendlay. And so when they bought Pendlay, Glenn merged with them, and he became like a 33% owner in Muscle Driver USA at that point. And so eventually, Glenn got his like internet fame by being the coach of Cal Strength, more or less. And eventually Brad Hess, the owner of Muscle Driver, was like, Glenn, we need you to come here, and we want the team to come here because we want the team to essentially be our marketing for this company. And Muscle Driver was essentially a direct competitor with Rogue at the time. They were actually bigger at one point. And a lot of the plates, like Muscle Driver and Brad Hess, actually had the exclusive rights to the plates from the manufacturer. So the Pendlay plates, like Rogue didn't have the plates they have now. They have the ones that they printed out, and they would basically, all the plates would ship, and they didn't have any branding on them, and they would get shipped to Muscle Driver. Muscle Driver would paint Rogue or Pendlay or whatever company on them and send them. And so Muscle Driver actually made most of Rogue's plates up until a certain point. And so this was basically a company that sold equipment to CrossFit gyms, more or less, when there was like the big CrossFit boom. And they were pretty successful in spite of not maybe being the best business people, because CrossFit was growing so fast. Like, it's almost like they were selling equipment so fast that it was just flying off the shelves. So that's what the company was, and Brad had this idea of having a professional weightlifting team as the marketing for the company, where we would kind of have personalities that would video our training, We did some silly things along the way, and we actually did have a pretty decent sized following. Like people would tune in, like a very loyal 5,000 people, and then we had a bigger reach, but like we had a very loyal group of about 5,000 people.
And so this was essentially kind of like a professional weightlifting team, similar to like what York was doing, right? And York at that time wasn't doing anything like this. And so I don't think that for a long time, I don't think that there was a professional weightlifting team in the community up until Muscle Driver basically created that, right? They used the money that they made from the plates to fund you guys, and then you guys were the marketing to help sell more plates. So it was kind of a hopefully a virtuous cycle, but I've heard that was not always like that with Brad, but I don't exactly really know the details. But then this really was just kind of a way for Glenn also to coach you guys and to not have to worry about making a living as a coach in a way. I'm not sure how much of that is to what degree that was, but it also seemed like it was a way to just be a professional weightlifting team and have elite athletes all together, supporting each other, pushing each other to be better, and kind of recreating maybe an Olympic training center vibe or a training camp vibe. So who were some of the athletes that were at Muscle Driver while you were there?
Yeah, I'll get to that in 1 second. So for sure, like Muscle Driver was a professional quote unquote weightlifting team, but now all of our funding to meets was funded, and that was like the biggest piece. And we did have a monthly stipend that was tiered. So if you were at the level, and it started out, we only had a men's team. It was like a very small thing. So it was $1,000 a month for the A team, right? And to make the A team, you had to be like the caliber where you would make the world team. And then there was a B stipend that was 700 and a C stipend that was 400. So like if you're only making $400 a month, then like you still have to work. You have to work if you're making $1,000 a month too. So I wouldn't say that we were making a living off of that. Some of us also had USAW stipends, so a select few of us were able to essentially train and not work, and I was blessed to be one of those people. I think Muscle Driver was extremely generous with us. I think like different people will have different perspectives. I think one thing that there could have potentially been like promises made that kind of sold people to move there, and then if they're only making $400 a month, like they're obviously not. They can't just train, right? They have to kind of figure it out. But that's life, right? Like most people who do the sport are not on stipend. But the original weightlifting team was myself, James Tatum, John North, Donnie Schenkel, Kevin Cornell, Chris Goot, and Tom Shiroka. I don't think I'm missing anyone, but and a guy named Mike Zella. Yeah, Mike Zella was a pretty good 69 kilo guy. I think that was the team originally.
Gotcha. And then later on, they added a women's team, and there are some pretty serious lifters there too. Holly Mangold was one of those. Who were some of the other women's team lifters that were there?
Taylor Harris.
Taylor Harris, yep. Heavy Metal Barbell Club now.
Yeah, and I mean there became like different iterations of the team. So like that was the original team, and we trained in this warehouse, and that was the original like vision of Glenn. So if you think of most of those people, like James at the time was kind of new. He became who he was later, but at that point he was kind of newer. Mike Zello was newer. They were good though, and they had athletic backgrounds where they had good work capacity. Tom had moved from Cal Strength with Glenn. He's a super heavyweight, and he had worked with Glenn for a while, even though, in the sport of weightlifting, he was kind of new, but he was a good thrower and had like a background in sports. So Glenn's vision was to train people who were already experienced in weightlifting and create an environment. And it kind of like didn't work out because eventually like Kevin left and then John and Donnie left. So it really changed the dynamic of the breakdown of the type of lifter that was there. And then we kind of like replenished the team. But we'll get into this later, but in the training approach, maybe it was geared towards coaching people with a lot of experience in the sport, like John, Donnie, Kevin, and myself, who could were resilient and had already built up to a certain work capacity. But when you have someone who's never trained like that before, it's really brutal, right? So eventually, uh, we moved to a different building and expanded, and we had a new set of tryouts. So when John and Donnie left, we ended out like getting many people. I'm gonna miss someone, but there was a guy named Trevor, and he was like a 150 snatcher in the 85. So he clean and jerked like 175, but his snatch was like really big. Um, Sean Rigsby came. We had like some other lifters that probably wouldn't know. At one point, Jonathan Garcia, I don't know if you follow powerlifting, but Jonathan Garcia has actually become like a silver medalist in the IPF World Championships in the 66 and is a world record squat holder. But he was there briefly, and I knew him from when we were kids at the Olympic Training Center. We went to a camp. So if people follow powerlifting, they'll know who he is, but if they don't, they probably won't. On the women's team, Rachel Davis, Holly Mangold was kind of the main one. Later, Kane Wilkes and Jared Fleming came, who had previous experience, and then Kane eventually became an Olympian. He was always pretty much coached by his dad and had brothers that did weightlifting too, so they have a pretty storied background.
And so what we talked about before we started the episode, we wanted to kind of do a little bit of a deep dive into some of the lessons that you learned from Pendlay and from training with Pendlay. So let's go ahead and get into that. This is 7 lessons learned from Glenn Pendlay. What do you got for lesson number 1?
Sure. I think one of the most fascinating things that I learned from Glenn, I did a lot of seminars with him, is that when you look at training approaches from other countries, they generally follow the principles of their culture. So if you take like the 2 prominent weightlifting systems, the Soviet system and the Bulgarian system, they really embody the culture of those countries at the time. So like the Soviet system, that was a communist country that was top-down approach, and they would always set like goals like, we want to have a goal for steel manufacturing. We want to generate this much steel, this much over this period of time, etc. And weightlifting was no different. So everything was very accounting oriented and tracked and structured in that way with those things in mind. And the Bulgarian system too, it was like a very brutal approach, like expendable. Like if a bunch of people get hurt but one becomes a world champion, that's all that matters, right? They're okay with that. So Glenn had this idea that he wanted to create a system that embodied the American culture so that it would connect with the average American. So it wasn't so much like copying the Soviet system or copying the Chinese system or copying the Bulgarian system. It was about coming up with a system that would fit our culture. And I found that to be really interesting.
And he also mentioned this when I got to visit him with training camps, is that the reason that he felt like something like the Olympic Training Center didn't really work in the United States, besides funding issues, was the decentralization of coaches, and just because the massive scale of our country, and also just like the free market approach that we have here, is that it couldn't ever really work because people would naturally gravitate towards the coaches who were either putting out the best athletes, like cranking out the best athletes, or who was closest to them that was doing the same thing. And so it kind of made sense that we needed a different approach that fit the structure that the United States had. And I also found that a pretty interesting approach. So what was lesson number 2 here?
Lesson number 2 is like, don't copy someone else's program. Like, use principles, come up with your own program based on those principles and constraints that you believe in, and build on that program. This isn't as common anymore, but back in the day, people used to say, hey, I need a 3-day-a-week program. So they like go online and look at Catalyst Athletics or whatever existed, and they would take a 3-day-a-week program and start doing it. And then they would say, I need a 4-day-a-week program now. And then they would do like a totally different program, right? So it's pretty common now that people will take that 3-day-a-week program and add to it. But back then that wasn't common. and that was something that he was a big influence on. So I think like his main athlete that he learned the most from was Caleb Ward, because he started coaching Caleb when he was around 12 years old. And you guys may or may not even know who he is. I mean, I'm sure you do if you train with Glenn, because he would probably have explained this. But Glenn's program, like our end program, the Muscle Driver USA program, was the end result of Caleb's weightlifting journey, right? So Caleb started training 3 days a week. You know, he didn't start training 9 times a week, right? So Caleb started training 3 days a week. And then as he got a little better and then his progress started to stall, he needed 4 days a week. So he added a 4th day. And then as he started progressing, he stayed on 4 days a week until he started stalling. And then he went to 5 sessions a week. And then 6 days a week. And then he introduced 2-a-days. So he eventually ended out with 9 sessions a week. But that was the end result. And I think Glenn, in hindsight, is known for being kind of like a more of a Bulgarian, go heavy all the time, butcher type coach, but he was pretty reasonable. And he had this idea that if you had kids coming to you, like back in the day when he was coaching kids, Muscle and Health would have like 3-day-a-week splits. And they would be like, Monday, Wednesday, Friday is a good split. So it was easy to sell to parents. It's like, hey, bring your kid in here Monday, Wednesday, Friday. We'll train 3 days a week. There's a rest day between each session. And that's really like a cultural norm, right? So again, going back to culture. So he was able to get kids in the door doing that. And then eventually, as the kids got more interested, he could sell the parents on a 4-day-a-week program and a 5-day-a-week program. But he was always about, you can never go back to being a beginner, right? If you're training 9 times a week, you can't go back to making progress on 4. So if you're making progress on 3 days a week or 4 days a week, milk it until you need more. And I think that's important and something that people don't talk about or realize because of what's put out there about Glenn's programming now. So I think that his story about progressive overload with Caleb Ward is really important because it's just a practical way. Like, I think there's a mathematical approach that's more accurate to progressive overload, but in simplistic terms, if you have a kid who starts training 3 days a week, you add 1 session at a time, never change the template, but you just add things to it. If they start getting fatigued, you know what to take back out. You know what I mean? And I think people used to not do that, and so that seems like a silly and obvious thing now, but it wasn't always.
You said that it was kind of like his training at Muscle Driver was really the end result of Caleb's training. What did that look like? Hobby weightlifters and competitors' training might seem the same, but there's one big difference. Competitors need to hit their best lifts on the competition platform. It doesn't matter what you did in training if you can't perform when it counts, and your program should reflect that. Instead of following random programming, maxing out all the time, and hoping for the best on game day, our Competition Strong Team program focuses on long-term progressions that set you up to have your best competition day yet. Each training cycle is carefully designed around the USA Weightlifting National Circuit, so you'll hit your biggest lifts at the Arnold, the American Open Series 2, and of course, the National Championships. If you're ready to take your training to the next level and get platform ready, then click the link in the description below or scan the QR code on the screen for a free week trial today. All right, back to the show.
Yeah, so at the end, like, we would train Monday, Wednesday, Friday twice a day. And in the morning, it would be like a warm-up session on snatch and clean and jerk with strength exercise. So usually, like, Monday would be back squats, Wednesday would be front squat, and then Friday we may just do snatch and clean and jerk. And then Monday afternoon was usually, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday afternoons were always heavy snatch and clean and jerk variation. Friday was always from the floor, so that's like our primary weightlifting day. And then Wednesday and Monday were always going to be like different variations at the beginning of a training cycle. So we might go, doubles from the blocks, or, sometimes it was singles Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, but Monday and Wednesday could be used in different ways to do hang snatches, complexes, different things. But it was always something snatch, something clean and jerk in the afternoon.
Gotcha. And then on Tuesday, were you guys also training Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday there? What were you guys doing those days?
Yeah, so those days we would do like a power snatch or a power clean variation, and then we would always do a push press. And those were meant to be like easier days. So we were still going heavy on, like, say you did like a no hook grip, no foot movement snatch. We would go heavy for that variation, but obviously you're limited by the exercise selection. Same thing with the power snatch. Most of the time it was up to a heavy single in his traditional program, but like not always, right? Um, and I think too, you know, how he coaches these athletes can be different. So like, I can explain like the general program, but how like, one of these topics, I'll kind of go into that. But Saturday was always usually like heavy back squat and heavy push press.
How did Glenn approach like longer term like periodization at Muscle Driver? Um, like what was like the phases like, or how did you guys choose what rep ranges to work on when?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we probably didn't have like different phases enough, right? I mean, I think there was some limitations to the actual program design. I think there's a couple reasons for that. Really, at Cal Strength, as like Caleb, John, and Donnie were training, and like the viewership grew. I think a lot of the changes that were made to the program, in truth, when I dissect it, is to get more viewership. People like watching heavy lifts, right? I mean, that's the truth. Glenn was very smart. He had a master's degree in endocrinology. Um, but I think that part of it had to do with what's interesting for someone to watch. Um, but we would do more triples and doubles on Monday from the blocks and hangs and stuff like that, and complexes on Wednesday when we were further out from competition. But the template would always be the same.
It's definitely something that I've noticed a lot more in the last year or two, especially as I talk to more and more high level athletes. Is like a lot of high level athletes don't take a particularly, I guess, like long term approach. A lot of times they view things like a lot more on like the week level. Like things are about getting ready for the heavy day that week. And I had the opportunity to live for a month with Hampton, and that's exactly how Hampton trains. Is like, yeah, like a little more volume in the beginning of the week, and then taper down eventually until that big heavy Saturday he does, where it's max snatch, max clean and jerk, some sort of max squat probably as well. Or maybe he's chasing fives, and there wasn't really a clear answer as far as like how they chose when to do what variations or when to do what rep ranges on squats or how that was happening. It was, they tracked like average intensity, and his best total of the week, and total tonnage, but they were just manipulating those variables over time slowly. It wasn't really like we're going to do a 4 week phase of tens. It's like, well, no, we know that the body doesn't really know, like, that it's doing a set of 10 or a set of 8. It just kind of knows, I don't know, what response to have to it, what stress is being placed total, in a total way. But I don't know, it's something funny, because you think like, oh, there's going to be way more complexity the better you get. But sometimes it's even more simple, I feel like.
Yeah, I think there are, like, as I've grown in the sport and, learned a lot more, and kind of like, I have spent a lot of time like learning what, I don't know, do you guys follow powerlifting like at all? Like raw powerlifting? So, so it's gotten way more popular, and the world records are shooting up a lot more. And like raw powerlifting, like, yeah, there's low bar back squat, and some people squat crazy, but some people squat like in a way that it would have transfer to weightlifting. And they have athletes, 83 kilos, 74 kilos, squatting like 700 pounds raw. And so this isn't like the old school Louis Simmons multiply powerlifting that everybody's on drugs, right? This is raw powerlifting, drug tested. Yeah, they're wearing knee sleeves and a SBD belt, like a lever belt. So they have like some equipment that's a little more than weightlifters have. But and yeah, like some of it's like the bar might sit a little lower on the back, but they're tracking so much, and this is a little easier to do in powerlifting, but they're doing a phenomenal job at tracking your progress, you know. And I've learned a lot from that. So I think there's a lot of limitations to how he trained and a lot of lost data. However, I think like the story of how Caleb got started and trained 3 days a week and progressed to this 9 sessions a week, like that in a practical sense is progressive overload. You don't have to track every single rep to know that if when I was 12, I was training 3 days a week, and then 14, I added a session, 16, I added a session, 18, I added a session. Eventually, when I'm 22, I'm training 9 times a week. I have had continuous progressive overload, and you don't have to overthink that or overplan it.
And I think also one thing that Calvin, you kind of mentioned, like there, it seems like there wasn't a lot of info about how to choose which variation or how to know exactly like what the plan was. What I noticed with Glenn, at least when I was there, was that it was really kind of he would assess what you needed on the day. And so sometimes that looked like, we'd have a heavy single on the program and we build up, and he would see what your lift looked like and be like, that wasn't that great, build back down, like start over and build back up again. Or, other days it would just be like, we're doing snatch, and you're like, how many sets, how many reps? He's just like, just start snatching and I'll tell you. And then, wherever he saw you needed work is what he would start to give you on that day. And so that was something that I observed. I don't know if it was different for you guys at all.
So think of like weightlifting back in the day is a lot different. It wasn't a whole lot of remote coaching, right? So if I was in the gym with you every day, it's kind of like a chef that gets a bunch of ingredients and you know how to use them because you've been cooking for 25 years. But when you're remote coaching, you kind of need to give the athlete a recipe, right? Because you can't just create this dish on the spot. And so, Glenn did most of his coaching throughout his career in the gym. And take like Olivia Reeves' coach, for instance. Like, he doesn't overplan things, and he has a very simple approach. And it's probably difficult for him to explain what Olivia does on a daily basis, because basically he does create what she's doing more or less on the spot, but it's based on experience level of like 25 years, right? It's not like he's like first year coach and it's just like, do this. So there's a rhyme or a reason, but there's no recipe.
Mm-hmm. That makes a ton of sense. I mean, that's exactly how I would describe it. As he was like a chef that was going off vibes, and he just knew how to cook. So let's go ahead and go. What is our next lesson here?
He had this saying like he wanted his athletes to help him coach them, right? And so what do I mean by that? Like the more that like you're able to discuss with your coach, like when you're a parent, right? So let's use this analogy. If you're a parent to an infant, you have to do everything for them. And as they grow up to an adult, eventually as an adult, like you're teaching them to be independent. And so like Glenn wanted to go through this process where like, yes, he's kind of giving you a program, but like you eventually, as you get more experience, need to have input as you understand, and the best coach athlete result is going to happen when the athlete understands what's going on and they're talking to the coach, and not necessarily like in a way where they know better or they don't want to do what the coach is saying, because that's annoying, but like in a way where they're talking it out and then creating the plan that the athlete believes in, the coach also believes in, and you execute it together. So let me help me coach you, is essentially how he put that.
I think that's a really fantastic piece of advice. And I wish more coaches would kind of lean more into that, like being open to hearing input from your athletes and taking the advice that, they're the ones experiencing the training, right? Like they're the ones that have the most insider info about what's going on. But on the coach's side, you have the experience to know, is that what is expected? Should they feel this way? Or is this not what the plan was? And so I think working with the athlete is really important.
I would hear people, on various teams that I was on as a kid, because I was in situations like the Olympic Training Center or Muscle Driver, where like you are sort of like the athlete and there is a coach who's like technically overseeing you. But they it's almost like they didn't like to talk to the coach and express their feelings on the things that they felt like they should be doing. But they would say that stuff to other athletes, aka like people like me on the team, but they wouldn't talk to the coach. And it's almost like giving themselves an out when they do bad at the meet. They'll be like, "Oh well, Glenn didn't program this for me, and I knew that that would work." Whereas, I always took the approach of talking to Glenn and being like, "I feel really strongly about this. Let's implement this," and he would always listen. So he's a pretty reasonable person, and like would always listen. And um, I think that you want to do things on your terms, right? You want to believe in it, and like he always thought that if the athlete believes in the program, even if it's not the ideal way to train or the ideal thing to do, they're going to do it hard and they're going to go for it and they're going to have a better result than if they're halfway into what the coach is dictating them to do.
And there's also a little bit of a shared ownership in the process too when the athlete and the coach are working together and the athlete brings something to the coach, says, I think this would work really well. And when the coach is willing to do that, I think a lot of the time you'll get more buy-in from the coach because from the athlete, because the athlete sees that the coach trusts the athlete to pay attention to what their training, what makes their training progress. And then also you are like, I have some input in the programming, and he's listening to me. Like, I really appreciate it. I don't want to lose that. So they may also like push themselves harder in training because of that too. And because there's that shared ownership in the training. So, I think that's a really great one actually. What's our next lesson here?
Yeah, I mean, this is pretty obvious, but what works for one athlete is not necessarily what works for another athlete, and how you communicate with one athlete has to be different. So, Jared Fleming and John North were both 94 kilo athletes through most of their career when the weight classes were different, etc. So, Jared really didn't have the kind of work capacity to go heavy often, but he actually had like I think you would say that he had a higher ceiling and got to a slightly higher point than John. John's a great lifter. But John really responded to like really high volume, and he's really hype and likes to train a lot. And so the way that Glenn would coach him is a lot different than the way that he would coach Jared, because Jared needed to get his back strong. He needed to rest more. He needed like 3 really big training sessions a week, and then the rest of it needed to be like back rehab and like balance work and stuff like that. Whereas John did a lot more specific training. And I think you'll find the way that he talks about Glenn's programming is the way that he experienced it, because that's what he needed from Glenn. And so it is true to what he experienced, but that's not true to how everyone experienced Glenn's coaching.
Absolutely. What are some examples? Do you have any interesting examples of how he approached training differently with different athletes outside of the John North and Jared Fleming story? Like, was there a difference between how he approached training you and James?
Me and James did do similar stuff, but we were built slightly different. So I was a big squatter, he's a big deadlifter, so there's definitely intricacies, right? Like we would do our snatch and clean and jerk work in the same way, but like our accessory stuff might be slightly different, and so that would be hard to, since we probably didn't do the best job at tracking everything that we did, it would be hard to come up with those examples from James's perspective. But Glenn definitely recognized the differences in our body types, our strengths and weaknesses, and also me and James had like a good head on our shoulders where we could have conversations with Glenn and kind of come up with strategies for ourselves with Glenn that were slightly different. So like 90% of everything was the same, but then the 10% would be different, right?
Did Glenn ever get into like athlete like typing, like different types of athletes? Like, did he ever like create groups, you think, or talk about that?
No, the only place I've really heard that is Garage Strength. Dane Miller's really big on that, and I think that's pretty cool. But we never talked about that.
Yeah, that's something I've noticed. I guess like a handful of coaches. Dane is definitely one of them. But a lot of times when people are trying to build like a bigger system, like I see that as maybe like one of the important aspects, I guess. Like when you're trying to really organize and like categorize athletes into what they need. Kind of like you said, like everybody's different. But I guess, mostly Glenn probably had everybody right in front of him, knew him really well, so he probably didn't have to worry about that quite as much, because he would just, like, kind of like we talked about in that chef example, like, know what someone needed on the fly or experiment with them, over the time that they were in front of him.
Yeah, yeah, and I think so. I mean, given that majority of the training happened like in a physical location, right? It's definitely a different situation than we find now as we do a lot of remote coaching, I believe all three of us, and we might even be remote athletes. I'm a remote athlete right now, so it's a different environment and the way that you have to approach it.
What's our next lesson here?
If you fail, do it on your own terms. This kind of ties into something that we already discussed, but if the athlete blames the coach after the fact, but they didn't express what they wanted to do, versus discussing the change with the coach and kind of like implementing it. So I think that he was big on like, following your heart and just keeping it simple and expressing those things.
Is there a story that you could think of that sticks in your mind for that? Because that's interesting. I want to learn more about that.
Well, I mean, a couple, but I wouldn't want to call anyone out specifically for not being able to discuss with Glenn or something like that. But yeah, I mean, I think in general, just the way that Glenn lived his life, it was on his own terms. Like even just aside from like coaching. And so I think it's just a lesson in general. Like if you're going to fail, do it on your own terms, and you can fail doing something you don't want to do. I think Jim Carrey has a story about his dad, wanted to be a comedian, but he became an accountant and then eventually got laid off. And so he essentially failed at something that he didn't want to do. So don't be afraid to do the thing that you want to do, because you can fail at the thing you don't want to do as well,
That's a great way to put it. Dang.
So, yeah, I mean, I think that pretty much embodies what I meant, aside from the athlete just being able to discuss. And, like, if the coach listens, like, whether you're an athlete or a coach, if you're discussing things, like, sometimes the coach might be like, no, I think that that's dumb. And if you've kind of, like, had some give and take in the relationship, the athlete can accept that. And then vice versa, right? If eventually the coach would be like, you might want to implement some of those things if they're not, too far from what you believe in that the athlete's asking for. So, okay, so 6 is just environment. Like what you see shapes what you believe you can do. So if you're seeing somebody clean and jerk 200 kilos every single day when you're a kid, you think that's normal. So you just say, okay, it's not like if I'm going to clean and jerk 200 kilos, it's when, and like if you see this person doing it, why can't you? But if you've never seen someone clean and jerk 200 kilos, you think that there's a limit below that. So I think like the point of Glenn wanting to eventually create an environment like Muscle Driver was to give people an environment where there was heavy weights being lifted frequently, to open up your mind to seeing what's possible. And also displaying that online to kids who would be watching, to show what's possible so they could surpass us, right? That was kind of the vision. He always said that if he won the lottery, he would essentially buy an apartment complex, probably nicer than the one that you stayed at, and have a training facility in the basement area where everybody would essentially train, and have a chef and all this stuff. But it all came down to like having this environment to foster belief.
Yeah, the environment I think is such an important one, and that was one thing that he did really well. He had this way about him that made you want to like not disappoint him, but not in an unhealthy way. You know what I mean? But in a like I want to do well. But then he also was able to create just an incredible training environment, and sometimes that was just the nature of the athletes that were there. But he definitely would. He would mold himself to the environment that needed to happen for everybody to have the biggest possible lifts. And I think another thing that you said there of like training around athletes who are clean and jerking 200 every day, where you just think that this is the norm. I think that's such a useful piece of advice for anybody who's training on their own, is to go and get out of the training environment that you're in, and go train around advanced athletes, go train around better lifters than you, because you can try to move as fast as possible, but if you aren't seeing somebody snatch your clean and jerk, I don't think that it's going to click. I think that there's just another level to that, where one, especially witnessing lifts on a consistent basis that would blow most people's minds, is really helpful for just removing the barriers that you might have. Were there examples of that at Muscle Driver when you were there, that really kind of shifted your perspective around training?
I don't think there was a point where I opened up my mind to knowing what was possible, because I feel like I already had a pretty deep background in that, living at the Olympic Training Center when I was a kid and stuff. Um, I do think that sometimes it's a detriment to me being in the sport for so long, because your ideas do get, like, your beliefs and what's possible do get shaped by what you've seen. And when you've been in the sport for like 20 years, like, I would have never believed that a female lifter like Olivia Reeves, drug free, would be doing what she's doing, right? I mean, like, snatching 125 and clean and jerking 156 now, I guess, like, those things, when we had like junior female lifters like clean and jerking like 115, we thought it was like insane, right? And so I sometimes it's good to be an outsider and not really have the so much evidence that something's not possible, right? When you've been in the sport for like 15 years and you've never seen a female weightlifter that's not a super clean jerk 150, like, it almost becomes like a limit, um, and it's not. Like, women's weightlifting is so young. Like, it's probably, now I'm more of a believer that we're going to see a lot of people doing what Olivia is doing. Um, so, and I think on the men's side too, like, just my own beliefs got shaped by lifters who maybe I put on a pedestal when I was younger, and they were super, super talented, but a lot of people didn't take the sport in a professional way. Like people didn't have nutritionists. Like, they thought counting macros was dumb. Like, there was debates, should you stretch or not? I mean, this is at the point that we were at in weightlifting when I was a kid. Like, these things seem so stupid now, but it's just how it was. And I think that so, like, there was a lot of people who were talented, but they drank a lot of alcohol. They, did recreational drugs. They slept around. They did all these things, that weren't really, like, they weren't training like Hampton's training. You know what I mean? Like, he's at home, he's in his element. Every day is the same. That, if you reduce all the outside variables, you can figure out if the training's working. If your life is erratic outside of training, you don't know if it's the training program or if it's the life you're living. So I think people take it more seriously now, and as a result, these people who are talented, I kind of thought it wouldn't be possible to do what they were doing, or I thought it'd be really difficult. But I think that my mind has been expanded to, if you take it 100% professionally, like, the things that they were doing were really impressive, but a lot of people could do them, and there's a lot of kids that are doing it now.
What do you think about the direction that American weightlifting is heading in? I feel like there's kind of been a big turning point maybe in the last few years, where we've seen kind of a lot of momentum, whether it is from athletes like Hampton and Olivia, but also maybe in a more systemic way. Like, they have like this new national team program, and the stipends are maybe a little better, things like that. Like, what do you think about a lot of the changes happening, and which do you think are the most impactful?
I still think that there's especially on the women's side, a lot of it comes down to talent, and some of it is like finding someone who's talented, who's willing to take it seriously. Um, so I think a lot of people, even at the top, still aren't training 100% correctly, but there's just not enough outliers so that when you have one, you're like, oh, like, I believe that Olivia is an outlier and she trains 4 days a week, but I don't think that most people would optimize their performance by training 4 days a week, I guess. You know what I mean? So I think we're still somewhat in the beginning of weightlifting, and if we had enough people like that, you would see different training methodologies make a bigger difference. I think right now you still have like talent is winning, and I don't think a lot of people are converging to similar ideas, but I think that's because there's a talent gap between different people. I think if you had enough people at similar talent level, then you would have ideas converging to more of a like truth.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I mean, we definitely like the talent is the biggest change that I've seen over the last 10 years is just the amount of people that are doing the sport is a lot higher, and therefore we're able to find outliers a little bit more. But I hadn't really thought about that in a way where like we still have, we're performing well because we have talent, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we've like figured out the system or figured out the way to produce like drug-free incredible athletes that are medaling at the Olympics. Like we've got some people who figured it out, but I don't know that we figured out the system yet. What are your thoughts on that?
I think a lot of people are doing good things in training, but I do believe that there is one true way to train, right? Or like, and it's not necessarily like everybody's doing the same thing, but it's like embodying certain principles and the amount of tracking and things that you structure throughout your life to optimize your performance. And I think some people are doing that, but I think everybody's doing something different, and that is the American way to a certain extent that, Glenn talked about with you and us, but that totally makes sense, right? And people like to copy. Like they're like this person, like, when I was coming up, like Kendrick Ferris was the man, and he's an amazing weightlifter. And because he was successful, everybody's like, let me try this LSUS program, right? And because he's so good that I'm going to copy it. And then, somebody else comes out and they're maxing out every day, like Ian Wilson or something. And you're like, he's doing something totally different. I want to copy that. Like, that's kind of like where weightlifting was at one point. So at that point, you're not really converging to a truth. You're just like, this person's good. I want to be like them. I'm copying them. This person's better. So I'm going to then change my approach to more of what they're doing, when neither of them is probably the ideal way to train, right?
All right, let's go ahead and let's hit our last piece of advice here. What was the last lesson you learned from Pendlay?
I mean, if you follow your passion, then it usually works out. Like, I think that Josh Gibson posted something the other day. There's like a photo they posted on Facebook, and it has a picture of Glenn, and it's like, I think like Josh and Seb had like this saying that I don't know if Glenn said it or not, but it was like the life of a samurai. But the quote is essentially like, I continue to believe that if you succeed at doing one thing really, really well, everything will work out. Your life will be worthwhile. Your life will have been a success. So yeah, I mean, I think when you find something that you're passionate about, follow your dream. And I think that that's something that he encouraged me to do. Like, when I moved to Muscle Driver, I pretty much dropped everything. And, I was at a point where I had a job as a software engineer, and I was just starting out, and I was watching weightlifting videos every day, and everybody was getting better, and I was not getting better. And I was like, this sucks. I'm not passionate about this at that time. Eventually, at the end of the day, I'm a software engineer now, but I'm more passionate about it. I feel confident that I'm at the right point in my life to be doing that. But taking that jump was important. The whole point of becoming, what people perceive as like a millionaire, having a lot of money, is to be able to travel, do what you want to do every single day. And as a weightlifter, I was able to do that for 4 or 5 years. I traveled all across the world, gave seminars in Australia, got to travel to so many different countries that I wouldn't have seen otherwise. It would have cost me so much money. I would have had to have saved so much money and had so much PTO from work to experience this. So essentially, I didn't make any money as a weightlifter, but I didn't go into debt or anything at the same time. but I lived the life of a millionaire, and it worked out. Through a little bit of luck and a little bit of skill.
That's absolutely incredible. It's so motivating. And for anybody who hasn't read this yet, I would definitely just search this up. Search up The Life of a Samurai, Pendlay. You'll find an article on his website that was from 2017, and you read that and you're going to want to run through a brick wall, but in a good way. So I definitely recommend checking that out for sure. Travis, thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it. This was a fantastic episode. And it was great to get a little bit more insight into Pendlay's coaching and more so like the impact that he had on you as a coach and the lessons that you learned from him. Was there anything else that you wanted to share?
Yeah, honorable mention. The last one is like routine is key. Like I think like you'll find that weightlifters, like people who are drawn to weightlifters, are people who can eat the same thing every day, can have the same daily routine, right? Not everybody can do that, but most of the time, that's the type of person that is going to excel in weightlifting. And Glenn, between training sessions, like we would embody that. Like we would go to this place called Salsaritas that's kind of like Chipotle, and we would get the same thing like every day. So like in a sense, we weren't optimizing our nutrition and doing everything right, but we had this like daily routine. We would train, go to Salsaritas, grab Starbucks, train, podcast, go to bed. It was like every week was the same, and that's kind of like how you get good at anything, is having the right kind of habits. But yeah, thanks for having me, guys. I appreciate it, and thanks for collabing, and nice to officially meet you.
Absolutely, yeah. All right, Calvin, where can people find you?
At Calvin Lackey, 81 kg on everything.
Travis, where can people find you?
Yeah, Travis Cooper, 77 kg on Instagram. Reach out if you're interested in online programming or anything like that, or just have questions or ideas for podcasts or, guests you'd like to see on the Weightlifting Scoop.
Absolutely. And you guys can find me at Big Ben Strength on everything. We'll catch you guys next week. Bye.
If you found this video helpful, then make sure to check out this video here or this episode of the Last Set, Best Set podcast.